Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines. Problem solving for our future. Lou. Common sense, logic, and reasoning. Lou. The man that can't stand hate and animus. Lou. Stimulating the thought process of America. Lou. Where being right is not political, it's factual. Lou. Providing real solutions in real time. And now, here's your host, Lou Palumbo.
Wondering what's going on in the country? You're not alone. A lot of Senate hearings focused on impugning the character and credibility of Donald Trump. Cleverly, the Democrats have used his own people and his administration to, I would say, highlight his unwillingness to accept the outcome of the election in 2020. Independent of that, they're pursuing the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, attempting to tie him to that. So we have two separate issues here. One deals with accepting the outcome of the election predicated on the fact that, Donald Trump asserted falsehoods. Each and every one of them were dispelled by individuals like the Attorney General, Barr, his assistant, another attorney, Hirschman, his daughter, her husband, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. So it creates an interesting psychological framework of the former president. What they're pursuing now regarding the insurrection on January 6th is whether or not there's criminality attached to the actions of the former president. This is where it's getting a little sticky because of this issue with due process. They are basically trying him in the media, which is just highly unethical, and also why we don't trust the media or our politicians, our elected officials, because they're all agenda-driven. And this is an example of that. If someone's going to accuse you of something, you should have the ability to enter into a retort. That's being denied. I guess the exercise is to prevent him from running for president again. The interesting part of this discussion is that the way to prevent them from indicting him, Donald Trump, is for Donald Trump to run, because then they can't indict him. This is like incredibly short-sighted. If I were the Democrats, I would come to the realization that the only person that they more than likely could beat in the 2024 elections is Donald Trump. Other than that, they're in a lot of trouble. We're about to witness that in November because of the condition of the country and the fact that we seem to lack leadership, any form of consistency. I'll give you a real quick example, and it has to do with what's going on with the Supreme Court justices and this lack of willingness on the part of the Attorney General Merrick Garland and even Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas to enforce federal law that prohibits anyone from attempting to intimidate or influence or threaten a juror, a witness, or a judge. It sends a really interesting message to the people in this country, regardless of where you're sitting. We just seem to think that we can enforce the law at our own personal discretion, and that's not how it was designed to be. So I would say we have some trouble going on here. In reference to the Senate hearings, I'm wondering why we haven't had a Senate hearing to address what's going on our borders. Why we have hundreds of thousands of people breaching our borders every month. I'm wondering why we haven't had Senate hearings regarding the major crime in our cities, why the government officials, not only on the local level, but the state level, have not insinuated themselves or interceded to answer this question. I'm wondering why we didn't have Senate hearings over the manner in which we withdrew from Afghanistan. I just say one rule universally applied. That's all. Simple. This is not a simple concept, just one set of rules for everyone. The fact that our government, for example, refuses to protect our federal judges, our Supreme Court justices more specifically, is inexcusable, and they should call for the removal of both Mayorkas and Garland immediately. Period. As far as I'm concerned, you are facilitating a crime, which is a criminal act. I guess we get you on high crimes and misdemeanors. Maybe we should impeach the both of them. I'm really struggling to understand what they don't understand about what we're doing to our country today, independent of your politics. I wish you loved your children as much as you love your political agenda and your political affiliations and all of these things, I guess, that give you comfort at the end of the day when you watch one of these 24-hour news cycles that just spew inaccuracies. What's interesting is that I've been chasing the 24-hour news cycle for a long time, discussing why you should not be spoon-fed by them, nor me. Go out, be your own investigator. The information is available to you. They're now speaking about the lack of credibility in the media and the statistics that are following it, how few people really believe in what the media is providing us. It's inescapable. It's unavoidable. It's the truth. And it's on both sides. Fox is driven with their agenda. MSNBC and CNN are driven with their agenda. And none of it lends itself to anything good for our children or the future of this country. So keep raking in your multi-million-dollar a year salary, saying whatever you want to say to whomever you decide to say it, whether there's any credibility or truth attached to it. See where we land, guys. We're destroying this country. We're going to have a really interesting individual on today. He's a doctor, PhD, Dr. Saul Cornell. He has, I believe, written a book on it's a Well Regulated Militia, the Founding Fathers and the Origin of Gun Control in America, which I don't think it's a moot point to have these discussions. I think what we need to come to terms with is the fact that we have so many firearms in this country today that it's almost unmanageable. And we've allowed that to happen, in particular over this past generation of children who we've lost. We've lost a generation of children. You can jump up and down about guns all you want. We need to look ourselves in the eyes and ask ourselves, what the hell happened with our children? What has influenced them so strongly that they are gravitating towards firearms to carry out their aggressions, their frustrations, their anxiety, their disappointment, their hurt, their being disenfranchised? Big question. First answer, failed parenting. Okay, guys, we're going to take a quick break and we're going to get right in to Dr. Cornell. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. So I gather from what I've read on one of your publications that you are very well versed in the history surrounding the Second Amendment issue, which is just nagging us today on an almost everyday basis. I want to first ask you, if I may, do you support the Second Amendment yourself, sir?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate your very kind offer.
My pleasure.
You know, I'm a huge Second Amendment fan. It's probably my second favorite amendment after the Third Amendment, which has got to be my favorite.
Why? Why is the Third Amendment your favorite?
You know, the Third Amendment is the most successful piece of constitutional text ever written, because the Third Amendment, which reads essentially that no one can quarter troops in a private home. Obviously, I'm summarizing it. We haven't had a problem with quartering troops since we wrote it. It's got almost 100% success rate. I think that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. It's humorous also. I gather the humor attached to it.
Yes, it does.
So let me ask you this. You support the Second Amendment. I support the Second Amendment. I think one thing that's critically important in living today is that when the times change, you must change with the times. Positions that you once held hard, maybe you need to acquiesce a little bit. You know, my position is that everyone who is supportive of the Second Amendment needs to realize that we have a common denominator attached to these mass shootings, for example, mental illness. Attached to that also seems to be another common denominator called failed parenting. We have some external influences on this generation of children. Video games, the genre of movie the entertainment industry is putting out, social media, controlled substances, bullying in the schools. I can continue on. I'm sure you could contribute. You know, part of my concern is that we're not putting the right foot forward in coming to a compromise that would help address these mass shootings, which are as recent as yesterday, the day before. And now we have a 22-year-old, one of our children, carrying a gun. He's a child at 22, let's be honest. A lot of these people at 22 have been through the military, and I was a law enforcement agent at 21, but we're still children. You know exactly what I'm saying, too. We're like what we call little boys in big men's suits, and we're carrying guns to neutralize aggressors. So I do want to ask you this. Why are they having such a difficult time wrapping their arms around the significance of the Second Amendment?
Well, that is a great question, and I've spent a good deal of the last 20 years trying to make sense of that. And I think the problem is the Second Amendment comes to us from a very different moment in American history. So, for instance, very few people, I mean, it's one of the most talked about amendments, but I find it's sort of an amendment that almost the more you talk about it, the less likely you are to actually know much about it, which is paradoxical. So, for instance, very few people realize that the right not to bear arms was arguably just as important when we first wrote our constitutions as the right to bear arms. Yet you don't hear much about the right not to bear arms. In fact, it's sort of hard to get your head around it. But in the 18th century, the government basically told all white men between about 16 and 60, you have to participate in public defense. You're required to do that. And we're going to transfer the cost of that, in effect, tax you by making you go out and buy a gun, the kind of gun that you need for a well-regulated militia, which is, in the 18th century, was typically a Brown Bess musket. Because, you need to have, if you don't have a bayonet that you attach to that weapon, you are basically dead after the first shot. Because by the time you get that second shot, the opposing forces are down right on you. Secondly, most of the guns that Americans wanted to have back then, very different than today, were the kind of guns that were good for putting food on the table. I mean, it's mostly an agrarian society. Most people are farmers. So most people would much rather have a kind of a fowling piece, which is much more like a shotgun than it is like an assault weapon or an M16. So the problem with that is it's good for hunting turkeys. It's not good for hunting British soldiers. So, we think of like the problem of the Second Amendment is, government will come and take weapons away. The problem they were dealing with is government wasn't doing enough to help people to get the weapons that they needed to participate in the militia. So the Second Amendment comes to us from a different world. It comes to us a world for relative gun scarcity, at least in terms of military weapons. It comes to us from a time when there's almost no gun violence in America between Americans. There's obviously a lot of gun violence in terms of wars with Indians. So given the Second Amendment came out of that society, which is so different than ours, how do we implement it today in a way that makes sense for Americans in the world we live in?
I say this, Saul, going back to your comments and your observations, and you mentioned the Third Amendment. What I do remind people of is when the Founding Fathers constructed the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, referred to as our Bill of Rights, the second most important thing in their mind was the fact that we have the right to bear arms because of tyranny and foreign invader, which we experienced in 1812. We had a subsequent war, not that I think it was related to tyranny or foreign invader, but it was the war with the Mexicans in the 1830s. Oh, yeah, and by the way, we're witnessing one in the Ukraine right now where we are actively arming their civilian populace to fight back tyranny and a foreign invader. I also say this, sir, and I'd like you to correct me if you think I'm wrong. I don't think the Second Amendment is about guns. I think it's about your freedom. And I think it's about the implementation of this tool to maintain your freedom.
So a couple of things to point out. So first of all, the Second Amendment actually wasn't the second most important right when they first proposed it. It was the Fourth Amendment. It only became the Second Amendment when they couldn't get enough votes to ratify the first two. So that's like another fact about the original Second Amendment that very few people realize.
Great fact.
Yeah. And so secondly, I totally agree that we have to understand the Second Amendment as part of the way the founders understood liberty. But the question is, did they understand liberty the way we understand liberty? And that's what I think is very hard for Americans to get their head around. So, for instance, the idea that government could force you to exercise a right. So we have the right to bear arms, but government can also force you to bear arms. We don't tend to think of rights in the modern world as something that government can force you to do. We tend to think of it as something that puts up a wall between you and government. Like, to get over that wall, government has to have a pretty darn good reason, and they ought not to be doing it for transient reasons, to sort of echo Jefferson. But in the 18th century, there are all kinds of things where you could be forced to do something that was good for the maintenance of the republic. So, it's everything from jury duty to participating in militia. So if you want to get your head around what they were thinking about, it's much closer to what the Swiss have or the Israelis have, which is, we are citizen soldiers. That doesn't mean we're private. We are regulated by governments because they were not too happy about Shays' rebellion, or people just, armed mobs. But, private citizens who are organized by law become the foundation for the militia. And the militia in the 18th century, it's important to realize there are no police forces. There really isn't a professional army. So the militia becomes like the Boy Scouts, the police force, the National Guard, and the Rotary Club all rolled into one. It's an important institution that holds that society together. We don't live in that society anymore. And so the key question is, how do we deal with this part of our history that's still with us when so many other things have changed? Now, I don't think there's an expiration date on the Second Amendment. Sometimes people say, well, you can have muskets, but you can't have modern weapons, or it's not relevant anymore. I don't think that's true, but it does require you to think really hard about how you translate stuff that made sense to them in terms that make sense to us. And that's not easy.
I agree 100% with you. I don't think the founding fathers obviously had an ability to look into the future. And, I hear the argument that there is no way they could have ever envisioned a firearm that they refer to as an assault rifle or a high-capacity semi-automatic pistol that holds 33 rounds. But I think, and I would say this conservatively, that their position on firearms would be consistent with the times. I also don't think the founding fathers would have ever envisioned the way the media has gone awry. A lack of credibility, a lack of veracity, and our elected officials. Something I think that's worth mentioning, sir. Population was estimated at the time of 1776 about 2.5 million. In my lifetime, I was born in 1951. There was 150 million people here. It's more than doubled. Along with the increase in population is the increase in problems exponentially. And firearms are one of them. But I want to make one point. We skipped along with firearms in our country. And let's be very candid. This country had a violent inception. And there's been a lot of violence through the history of this country because we have man. Man is faulted. But it took a whole new turn on April 20th, 1999 with Columbine. In a rather conventional sense, if I may, we had firearms just kind of in the culture, skipping along. We know what happened during the Prohibition era with Al Capone and the weapons. I'm very knowledgeable in this area because of my occupations. Something happened after Columbine that has really opened this up to discussion to the level that it is. And tragically, what we're learning is that with the inception of new laws, isn't the translation into reduction of crime a violent crime, period. So I'm struggling to understand why the people that lead this country in particular and why the media aren't part of a solution as opposed to feeding a problem.
Another big question. So when people talk to me about this issue, what I try to stress is, so in modern America, the two positions you hear most often about this issue, setting aside the position which is the most common position on almost every issue, which is, I don't know, or whatever. But for people who care about this issue, you oftentimes get it divided in this way. They're either pro-gun or pro-regulation. The problem is the founders were both pro-gun and pro-regulation. And that's the position that is hardest to sustain in our very polarized society. Because if we were having like a calm, rational debate, the question to ask is pretty simple, right? Are there any gun laws which, if you pass them, you can reduce fatalities at the lowest possible cost to gun owners? That should be the question we focus on. And there should be an empirical answer. Now, the right combination of policies might be different for Alaska than for the Bronx, which, the last time I checked, the Bronx and Alaska had very different kinds of gun cultures, very different sort of realities. And the genius of the American system has always been to acknowledge that certain kinds of problems have to be adjusted to the differences in our very big and very diverse society. So that's why federalism makes a lot of sense for America. Federalism, if you live in Liechtenstein in Europe, doesn't really make a lot of sense when you got a country that's a postage stamp size to begin with. But in a country like America, you're never going to frame laws perfectly for Alaska and Massachusetts about guns. So one of the things that needs to happen is we need to acknowledge that there are going to be some very different gun laws in different parts of the country. The big problem we have is that gun markets do not follow state lines. Like in New York, hardly any guns from New York actually originate, guns used in crimes originate in New York. Same is true in Chicago. So what do we do if Indiana, which is a very pro-gun state, is next to Illinois, which is a state that has Chicago in it and has to have a different set of policies? I mean, that's a kind of calm, non-ideological, pragmatic debate that we're not having. Like for instance, people often say, well, just enforce the laws that are on the books. But how can you do that if you don't fund ATF and you don't allow them to have computers to run trace data? They still have to go into trailers and pull out pieces of paper because they're forbidden to have a database for this fear that, it'll be part of some, gun confiscation registry. It just doesn't make any sense. It's the 21st century. If you're going to argue that we need to deal with gun violence, you got to give the police and law enforcement some basic tools. And I would say computers are one of them.
We're going to go to a quick break, Dr. Cornell. We'll be right back. We're going to continue this conversation, and I want to speak to a little bit about what you've just brought up because it's a very interesting point. This is Between the Lines. Please feel free to call us or email us, betweenthelines.tv. You can find us, and we're going to be right back. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, and we have a very interesting and I would say a special guest because of his insight and wisdom and understanding of the Constitution in a very broad sense, I glean, and in particular with the Second Amendment. Dr. Cornell is currently teaching, I would say, at Fordham University, which is up the block from where I went to school, St. John's. Mm-hmm. He is a professor on the of history at Ohio State University and the director of the Second Amendment Research Center at John Glenn Institute. He is one of the nation's leading authorities on early American constitutional thought. He's authored 3 books: a well-regulated militia, the Founding Fathers, and the Origins of Gun Control in America. So I want to continue this conversation, sir, and the first word I want to whisper in your ear, Saul, is enforcement. We don't have enforcement. We have no boundaries. We have no consequences. They jump up and down about gun control. I like the word management because it's less offensive. Words are really interesting. You can put people off. I think we have a management issue here, but we have an enforcement issue. We have an issue of boundaries and consequences in this society in general. And I'll give you another example that is tangential to our discussion. We have people protesting outside the homes of our Supreme Court justices, which is a violation of federal law. And there's a lack of willingness to enforce the law and to telegraph to our people there are boundaries with judges, witnesses, and attorney, everyone. You can't intimidate anyone. You can't influence. We're on a very bad course right now. And I hate to break everyone's heart because I've studied this issue of guns in America. I didn't have to go very deep. There are about 500 million of them we can conservatively estimate that are here. About 50 million of them are assault rifles. They're not going anywhere. So why don't we put the politics aside, sir, for the purpose of education and understanding of the Founding Fathers in this country that we should not take for granted, learn what the Founding Fathers were thinking, and start to become part of a solution instead of feeding a problem. Here's something else, Saul, that you may or may not be aware of. We have embarked on 25 of our states right now that have what we call constitutional carry. That by the very nature of the Constitution, the residents of their states may carry a concealed weapon without a permit. We have no vetting. Forget vetting you when we can conduct a NICS check, National Instant Criminal Background Check, right, a 4473 form, right, which is trying to determine if you're a felon. We have nothing. And we have states on the on-deck circle, Florida, South Carolina, Utah, heading in that direction. This is time to put our differences aside and start to figure out how we're going to manage this problem for the sake of our children, not our political agenda or our political affiliations. This is where like the cuckoo left the clock here. I don't know if you heard me, but I went to St. John's.
Yeah, no, I did hear you. No, I mean, I agree. And as a former law enforcement person, I'm sure you appreciate this more than most. It's certainly been something I've noticed with the returning vets I've taught at Fordham and at Ohio State, which is we do not allow U.S. military to pick up guns without an awful lot of training. We don't allow cops even to walk out of the station with their new service revolver unless they've put in a certain number of range hours with the new gun, even if they already have qualified on their previous gun. Yet, as you just mentioned, we have this notion of constitutional carry. If you give a guy a gun, he doesn't become a good guy with a gun if he doesn't have any training or she doesn't have any training. So at a very minimum, this idea that we should be handing guns and making it easier for people to have access to guns without proper training is just nutty.
Here's what I propose, sir. And I do a live television show in Jacksonville from 5 to 6, Mondays and Tuesdays. And this is a very pro-gun environment that I'm in. It's very deeply enriched. This is what I am asking my callers. I want to make a proposition to you, sir, that if you want to carry a concealed weapon in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, the U.S. territories, the same privilege I have as a retired law enforcement officer under LEOSA, the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act, right?
Yeah.
That you can do so. Let us vet you and train you and educate you the same way we do our law enforcement community. Every single person says they would do it. Every single one of them. The issue here is preventing the mentally ill and emotionally unstable people from getting their hands on firearms. We've got to start somewhere at some point. But we don't even have this conversation. We're living in the all or nothing society. You know, it's a my way or the highway. Well, guess what? That highway mentality is impacting the future of our children, which is why I do this show, Saul. I don't need to hear myself pontificate. I've been beating my brain up with the same thoughts for so many years. I can't forget them. I can't get them out of my head. But I'm looking at the future of our children, the young people in this country who are entitled to something better than this. That's what I say here. I think we should have, and I want to start real easy with everyone, so just start a conversation. Let's say you'd like a high-capacity semi-automatic pistol or this highly desired assault-style weapon that they refer to as assault-style, others refer to as a sporting arms. I don't want to get into the semantics.
But the high-capacity, high-velocity
Thank you.
rifle.
Right. So we want to give that to you. But here's what I'd like you to do. Go through Minnesota multiphasic screening, Rorschach, word association, interviews with psychologists, psychiatrists, the same way we do in law enforcement. Then extensive firearms training. Then an education in the law as to when you may use that weapon and how, and specifically with deadly physical force. Now, I'm not the smartest guy on the planet. I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I went to St. John's, which is a good school, by the way. I wasn't exactly, I wasn't killing it as a student. I got to be honest with you because I was distracted and I got in school very young. I was 17 years old when I started college. I was 16 my senior year. So you can see I was a little
precocious.
I needed to be a year older, but I still caught on pretty quick. When I graduated college, I went into law enforcement. My education really began because I started to understand this country, its strengths and its weaknesses. And we need to start to address this in every area, not just gun controls, to be very candid with you, our borders, what's going on in our major cities, our foreign policy, this whole dependency upon foreign entities to drive our nation today. This is, who the hell is running this place? Now, I don't want to ask you how old you are, Saul. I'm 70. I was around for John F. Kennedy. I went to 16 years of Catholic school. I was spoon-fed him by Irish Catholic nuns. I happen to have liked the guy. I had a tremendous amount of admiration. based on the way he packaged and presented himself. You know what I'm talking about. But they referenced the best and the brightest back then. Look what they've done to the country. How about a little common sense, logic, reason, decency, civility? How about a little empathy? Why are we teaching our children this to begin with in our educational environments? But this whole thing with firearms in particular, this is a fixable problem. You got to give a little to get a little. But I think they're coming to the realization, Saul, that guns aren't going away, and especially assault rifles. Because if you look at this new bipartisan legislation, right, where we just were happy if we don't get 18-year-olds to buy assault rifles now. They've conceded the ban on assault rifle. I don't think they hear the drums beating, or maybe they're starting to hear the drums beating. But the country, I think the expression is opposite of the desired result. We're not getting less guns. We're getting more guns. So dial the rhetoric down. Stop polarizing the country on this topic. Learn about the Constitution. Explore the mindset of the Founding Fathers, who, by the way, are under siege, Madison and Jefferson. This is disgusting. They're attacking the people that built the foundation of this country. The next thing they're going to do is attack the foundation of the country, which they're trying to do right now. You know, I don't mean to tangentialize with you. I do this all the time when I speak, because you know what happens, Saul? All these conversations intersect. It deals with the future of this country and the future of our young people and our children. So I didn't mean to go on a rant like this, but I don't get aggravated or upset. I just am confused, because I just live by KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. But I think there's an extreme relevancy for people to understand, as you've just articulated, what was going on in this country at the time. Now, I do know that you've mentioned the fact that we've had some violent historic periods. Am I correct?
There have been some times in American history where there was a fair amount of violence. Yep.
And if we have the Wild West, if we recall, am I correct? What were the gun laws like back then?
Well, I mean, that's, of course, again, one of the great ironies. You know, if you get your history from Walt Disney's Wild World of Davy Crockett, you get one vision. But in fact, there was quite serious gun regulation in the West. You know, you check your guns at the edge of town, and that was one way they kept people from killing each other. I mean, that's sort of the interesting thing. You know, if you look at like Switzerland and Israel, those are the two Western democracies where they don't have as many guns as America, because nobody does. I mean, as you suggested, we have enough guns for every man, woman, and child, and probably enough for most of our dogs too. So, I mean, we just have tons and tons of guns. So, but in those countries, you have relatively high levels of gun ownership, but the laws are very strict. You know, in Israel, if you don't have military service, you're not getting a handgun until you're 25. And you're only getting a certain number of rounds of ammunition to take outside unless you're training with your firing on. And you have to go through extensive background checks. So, yeah, Israel, they have a lot of guns. Most people know how to use them, and they don't have a lot of gun violence. So I think you're right that there are ways to live in a society with high levels of gun ownership, but it comes with a lot of responsibility and some pretty common sense kind of regulations.
You know, you're bringing up excellent points, but I just want to say one thing that you alluded to earlier. You made a comment about a country being the size of a postage stamp, comparatively speaking, to the United States. You also have to look at their populations. Our population is 335 million people. The UK, I think, is like 60 million people. Yeah. These other countries, they're even smaller. And I'm very familiar with what Switzerland mandates and Israel, and they're on the right track. I think for our purposes, the horse got out of the stall, and now we really don't. I don't know if we lack the aptitude, the intent. I don't know what it is lacking to try to get this problem to some form of management. You know, that's my take on this thing. I don't like this word control. Nobody likes the word control. They need to soften the rhetoric a little bit and try to sit down. You know, and I have to be honest, truth be told, the NRA, who believes if you can see lightning and hear thunder, you should own a gun, you know, they need to step away from this argument, because they're just fueling the division. We need cooler heads to prevail on this topic in particular, but this is just one of them. We're going to go to a quick break, Dr. Cornell, and come right back to you. I want to ask you about your book, if I may.
Sure.
This is Between the Lines. I'll be right back. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, and before I get into a discussion with Dr. Saul Cornell, who is he's a teacher at Fordham and Ohio State. I mean, he's just all over the place. He's very diversified in his knowledge and understanding of our Constitution, and in particular the Second Amendment. I want to ask you about your book. Give us what motivated you to write it, for example, and who did you want your audience to be?
So sorry, we have quite a selection of books back here. So which one are you talking about?
I'm referring to the Well Regulated Militia.
Oh, okay, gotcha. All right. So that book I wrote because I was trying to figure out a basic problem, which is how did we get into this mess where we have these two radically opposed views of what the Second Amendment means? One side said it's about a collective right. The other side said it's about an individual right. And basically those two framings of it, individual, collective, those are terms that are very modern. But the founders didn't see things that way. They talked about natural rights. They talked about common law rights. They talked about inalienable rights. None of those 18th century terms that I've just listed maps perfectly to modern categories. So for instance, we talk about inalienable rights. Well, what does it mean that a right is inalienable? Well, the word alienable comes from English property law, and it basically means, can you sell it? Do you have a right to divest yourself of this property? And then, of course, under English law, if you were an aristocrat, in order to keep property in the family, you had primogeniture so that the lord of the manor keeps the property, and, the second son goes off to the army and the third son goes off to the ministry, et cetera, et cetera. So that language of rights, linking it to property, that's essential if you're going to understand what it means to have a right in 18th century America. The fact that you have a right doesn't mean it's not subject to regulation. The question is, how do you regulate things in a way that's consistent with the common good? And how do you build in checks and balances so that legislatures don't overstep their mandate? That's the way they understood things back then. That's not how we talk about rights and regulation today.
I just want to ask you, Saul, all those books behind you are books you have written?
No.
Okay, because you scared me for a moment here.
That's my shelf, and then I pulled out a few books there.
Oh, good. Very good. I'm glad that you did that. This is a very emotionally charged topic, and there's a lot of hypocrisy attached to it. But my greatest concern is that the country's going in a direction where we're getting away from the management of firearms. We're just, the way firearms are being consumed today because of the rhetoric, right, and all of these little catchphrases like, I'm going to come take your AR-15, Beto O'Rourke, or every time they mention gun control in a Democratic administration, it's the best marketing and sales the firearms industry can possibly have. We're going in a direction that's getting, I would say, exponentially more dangerous every day. I'm not opposed to people, as you mentioned earlier, having firearms. My problem is that we're not trained, we're not educated, we're not vetted. This is the direction I think we should go, and I think that that's a reasonable expectation in light of the fact that we've gone from 2.5 million people to 335 million people. That in 1970 we had 200 million people. We bumped it up from there 135 million people. But I just the problems with all of these discussions we're having, including gun management, is driven by the media. The media are basically untethered. They create your optic and your narrative, and they're not responsible in the way they're doing it, and they're starting to come to terms with the fact that people don't believe in them anymore. By the way, people don't believe and trust the government, which is partly why
the Supreme Court was once the most respected branch. Now it's right down there with Congress in the basement, 25% approval rating. That's astonishing for the Supreme Court.
But what drives that, Saul? What drove the dilution of the importance of the Supreme Court? How did that come about? That came about through the media and through our elected officials. They did that. Because if it didn't fit their agenda, we decided right away we were going to undermine the very institution that's at the core of the country.
Well, I think, one thing to keep in mind with the Supreme Court is when you start to break norms, there are consequences. So when Mitch McConnell decided he wasn't going to allow Obama to have any Supreme Court appointment his last 2 years, and then turns around in the last few weeks when Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies and rushes through Amy Coney Barrett, that produces a kind of cynicism that, in fact, you're just going to change the rules to get the outcome you wanted. And the one thing about the Supreme Court is it's supposed to be a neutral body. It's not supposed to be a body where you change the rules to get the outcome you want. And that's why we have a crisis of legitimacy with this court, because they want, they have the votes and they're swinging for the fences. And, the very definition of what it means to be a conservative, if you're a judge, is gradualism and modesty. But yet we have a right wing, which is not conservative in any sense, swinging for the fences. That's almost the antithesis of traditional judicial conservatism, which, I tell my students, I'm a judicial conservative and I'm, kind of a political progressive. And they say, well, how can that be? I said, well, that's because political decisions should be made by legislative branches, and I have my policy agenda. But judges should really try and step out of the way and only get involved if it's a obvious manifest violation of the Constitution. And they should find ways not to get ahead of public opinion, not to get ahead of the legislative branches. They should operate in a very narrow and limited way. And that was how judges operated for a long time, but not recently.
The one thing I want to ask you also, there's no question that there's a bias attached to our politics, our political system, but I don't believe that bias exists with our Supreme Court justices. I think that they are sincerely invested in understanding the Constitution and the intent of the Founding Fathers, contrary to public opinion. We just went through this with Roe v. Wade. They didn't say don't have abortions. They said the reserve clause in the law, correct me if I'm wrong, when an issue is not spoken to in the Constitution, is reserved to the state to remedy. Am I correct? I don't see them as biased. I think they're just adhering to the Constitution. Am I wrong?
I suppose we would disagree on that. With the abortion decision, their view is throw it back to the states. Yet with the gun decision, let's take that power away from the states, even though the states have had that power since the very beginning. So they do seem to sort of change the rules up and change the methodology and change the evidence and change the time period that's relevant. One of the really bizarre things is in the abortion case, they say the period of the 14th Amendment around 1868 is the key. In the gun decision, they say, we're not so sure that the period around the 14th Amendment is key. We think it's 1791. You have to have the same rules apply to each decision. And the problem is this court seems to change the rules, change what counts as evidence. Some people are calling it sort of Goldilocks originalism. This evidence is too old. This evidence is too new. This evidence is from Texas, and that doesn't count. You can't do that kind of make it up as you go along if you're going to have people respect the court as a neutral legal institution. So I just think this court is sort of, one of the biggest problems we all have is something called confirmation bias, right? That is one of the most fundamental lessons we have from psychology, is that you have to work really hard not to assemble the facts to fit the narrative that you bring to the table. And I'm afraid that, these Supreme Court justices on the right of the court are leaning into their biases as opposed to trying to evaluate whether their biases are justified.
Yeah, but what if their biases are what's in line with what's best for this country? Because I'm looking at the left. I hate these terms, by the way, because they're polarizing. But I'm looking at the agenda of the left in general in this country, which is like anything goes. Your major cities, we don't arrest and prosecute people. There's no boundaries, no consequences. We have 200,000 plus people a month crossing our southern border, which is a crime. Our foreign policy in Afghanistan was embarrassing. Our economy, we're now basically subscribing to the notion that we empowered a foreign adversary to have this type of influence on our economy and our national security. That's the left, and I'm not a Republican. I just like telling the truth. So I hear what you're saying about the bias, but I have bias myself, but it lends itself to what's best for this country, but first and foremost, what's best for my children. And I don't see that in the Democratic Party today. I think you're going to have to agree that this party in general is in trouble. They're splintered. They're fractured from within. Go.
I mean, if you're asking me, do I think both of our political parties are deeply flawed and not addressing the issues that concern Americans? Yes. In fact, I've taken to telling my students we only have two parties in America today, and most people would agree that one is stupid and one is evil. Now, half the people think one party is stupid and the other is evil, but they both agree that those are the two parties. They may disagree which party is which, but those are basically the two parties we're dealing with, and that's a problem. I mean, think about it. Think about, imagine George Washington turning to his left for economic advice, and there's Alexander Hamilton, and turning to his right for foreign policy advice, and there's Thomas Jefferson. We're definitely not living in that world. I say we used to sort of have giant mammoths that walk the earth, and now we've mostly got kind of furry rodents creeping about, and, that's a problem.
I ask you this, Saul, that wouldn't you think had we kept the population at something more manageable, we wouldn't be facing the problems on the scale that we are today? And I want to say something else. You're probably unaware of this, but I've worked for ABC for over 30 years. I've worked for CNN since 1996, Al Jazeera. I work for a lot of these reporting agencies. Here's some interesting statistics. The population is 335 million. If 10% of those people were in dissent, that would be 33 million people. Right. If 5%, it would be 16 million people, rough numbers. 2.5%, 8 million people. We look like the walls are coming down here. This is a handful of people pushing this country into instability. It's a handful of people. Most people in America are just trying to get by. They're trying to survive, stupid and evil. You're right about that. And maybe what we're talking about is that we need to come to terms with the fact that we've outgrown this political system that we have. That doesn't mean that we need to abandon it. We need to expand on it with representation. That's just what I'm just spitballing here. And a lot of the comments I make, Saul, are designed to just open up a conversation. They're not like I'm saying it with an assertion that this is how it should be. Let's just start a conversation at some point. And I think you would agree with that. Look at the population of this country. Let me ask you this, Saul. How do you manage the diversity, ethnically, religiously, and culturally under one roof the way we're trying to, and keep everybody happy?
Well, I mean, that's, of course, what the system was designed to try and do, although you're quite right that the scale is beyond anything. When Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, I think the Department of State had like 2 translators. That was the Department of State, and a couple of ambassadors. So, think about that now. The Department of State is all over the globe, and it's thousands of people, and it's got millions and millions of dollars for a budget. The scale of our country is almost beyond anything that Jefferson, who really thought big and thought about the future, could barely get his head around. So I agree that there are some serious problems. One problem we have is that we've got this sort of partisan gerrymandering that both parties do. And what partisan gerrymandering does is, already the system is sort of stacked against populous places because, North Dakota and Montana are always going to have 2 senators. And that's hardwired into our system because of the peculiar nature of the way America evolved from colonies into states. But we certainly are making it worse by this kind of partisan gerrymandering. I looked at some of the districts in New York City, and, they look like a Rorschach test. Like somebody just threw a whole bunch of ink against a map and carved out a district. I saw one district that starts like in this part of Brooklyn and goes all the way across to Queens. And then, it's just kind of crazy. So, and unfortunately, again, I blame the Supreme Court here. One of the things the Supreme Court is supposed to try and do is step in when the system can't correct itself. That's one theory of like what the role of the Supreme Court is. So if laws are preventing your access to courts or to vote, that is where the Supreme Court should be high alert. Anything that takes off the table the peaceful mechanisms we built into the system to change it for the better, that's where the Supreme Court should really look very, very closely. And they're not doing it. They're like, spend as much money as you want, gerrymander the hell out of things. Freedom is important. And, I know that Elon Musk should be able to spend his money and Jeff Bezos should be able to spend his money. But at some point, the founders were worried about corruption almost more than anything. And the one thing that we don't have in our system are the guardrails against this kind of unbelievable corruption, whether it's in the form of money or gerrymandering. And, here's my basic take on American politics. And I tell this to my students. I say, first of all, if you've ever called for jury duty, you absolutely have to go, because not only is it your obligation, it will teach you so much about American life and American law. And what I find is that when people walk into a voting booth, their IQ drops like 40 points. When they walk into a jury booth, their IQ jumps 50 points, because the deliberation and the respect and the conversation that emerges from the jury pool makes people better. Whereas when we go off into the voting booth, that's where we get stupid and evil. So the key question is, what can we do to make us more like Americans when we act on juries, where we're responsible and we're thoughtful and we think, how would I want people to treat me if they were in my jury pool? That's what we need, and that's what's lacking.
Well, here's what I have to say in closing, because we got to go. First, I need to apologize to you because I took you off on a bunch of tangents independent of the initial discussion with gun control, but there was a reason, because I know you have a lot of wisdom in a lot of areas other than firearms. I think you and I are talking about the country. I think that this gun control issue or gun management issue is tangential to the overall direction the country's going. And I thought it was important that you have an opportunity to speak in a much broader sense, to be very candid with you. So I apologize to you if it's necessary. And
No, not necessary. It was fun.
Yeah. Well, I just think there's so much more going on in your head other than just about firearms in our country. The same thing with myself. I think in a very broad sense, but I want to make sure you come back. Make sure that you come back.
We can discuss this book, which is how the Founders Constitution collapsed because of Andrew Jackson.
Can we do that the next show?
We'll do that the next show.
How
democracy killed the Founders Constitution.
Interesting. Guys, that's it for today. We had an incredible guest, Dr. Saul Cornell. He's published quite a number of books regarding our Constitution, the Second Amendment in particular, a regulated militia. A well-regulated militia is actually the name of the book, a Founding Fathers and the origins of gun control in America. But he also has a lot of wisdom as far as our country in a very general sense, broad sense, a very clear understanding. Yes, his opinions, like we all do, but they're productive and they're fruitful, and I guarantee you'll learn from him. We're going to get him back here, guys, but for now, I got to let you go. This has been Between the Lines. Thank you.